Athens is remembered as the shining cradle of democracy, a city that spoke of liberty as if it were a gift to the world. But hidden beneath its marble ideals were women whose lives told another story. Women enslaved, whipped in public squares, branded with iron, and silenced inside households that thrived on their suffering. They left behind no words of their own, only scars written into history by others. To speak of Athenian freedom without them is to tell a half-truth. Their pain demands remembrance, for without their bondage, the liberty of Athens could never have stood. Athens, the birthplace of liberty, hid its freedoms behind chains. The city that prided itself on equality before the law and open debate in the assembly also relied on a population denied even the most basic rights. Among the enslaved, women suffered in ways that reveal a deep contradiction at the heart of Athenian democracy. The same society that gave the world words like isonomia and democratia built its daily life on the labor and suffering of women who had no protection, no voice, and no recognized identity of their own. Citizens celebrated their freedom in the public square, yet in the same spaces enslaved women could be whipped, branded, or humiliated without consequence. This silence around their lives was not accidental. It was a deliberate exclusion that kept their pain outside the civic story Athens told about itself. What punishments held them in submission? What practices ensured that these women remained obedient even under the harshest conditions? To understand the lives of enslaved women in Athens, we must look not only at their labor inside households but also at the punishments designed to remind them, and everyone watching, that they were property. And beyond ordinary chores and domestic duties lay punishments meant not just to control but to instill lasting fear. Their capture was only the beginning. Their punishment was the guarantee of obedience. In Athens, female slaves, known as doli, were drawn into bondage through many channels. Wars brought prisoners from Thrace, Phrygia, Lydia, and other regions, where defeated populations were seized and sold. Piracy across the Aegean supplied steady numbers, while organized slave markets reduced human lives to simple transactions. Young women and children were especially at risk, torn from families and placed into households far from their homelands. Unlike many male slaves who worked in fields, mines, or workshops, women were pulled into intimate spaces of the oikos, the household. This placement made them more vulnerable, as their labor was constant and their bodies were exposed to direct control by masters and mistresses alike. They had no legal protection against exploitation and no recognized family ties that could shield them. Their foreignness, their gender, and their isolation combined to ensure they could be subdued more easily than men. Athens built its system of control on this vulnerability, creating not just a labor force but a social order where women's subjection was naturalized. Yet their capture and placement was only the foundation. To understand how they were kept in place, we must look at the laws and customs that turned violence into an accepted form of governance. Truth, for Athens, had to be beaten out of a slave woman's body. The legal system of the city-state treated enslaved people as fundamentally unreliable, their words considered worthless unless forced under pain. This practice, called basanos, meant that the only way a slave woman's testimony could be accepted in court was through torture. The assumption was clear: truth could not come voluntarily from someone regarded as property. For female slaves, this codified rule carried heavy consequences. It placed their bodies directly at the center of legal procedure, making physical suffering not just common but officially sanctioned. Violence was no accident or excess. It was written into the laws themselves. A mistress or master could deliver punishments privately at home, but when the courts required information, the same violence became a matter of civic duty. The lash, the rack, or other forms of coercion served not only to extract words but to reaffirm social hierarchy. A slave woman's pain became evidence. Her cries transformed into legal proof for free citizens. This deep entanglement of violence with law shows how thoroughly Athens normalized brutality as part of order. But if courts accepted torture as the path to truth, what did punishment look like in everyday life, outside the courtroom, when discipline was carried out in public spaces? Even the stones of the agora bore witness to the lash. In Athens, whipping was not hidden behind closed doors but often carried out where others could see. the central marketplace, the banks of the Eridanos River, and the areas around public workshops all became stages for punishment. Female slaves who erred in their tasks or showed signs of resistance might be taken into these civic spaces and flogged under the eye of overseers. The whip, or mastix, was more than a tool. It was a symbol of power. Vase paintings and literary references remind us that its presence was constant, a visible marker of who held authority and who was bound to obey. By inflicting pain in full view of citizens, masters reinforced the rigid hierarchy that sustained the democracy. Punishment in these locations served two audiences at once: the enslaved woman, who felt the blows directly, and the public, who were reminded of the boundaries separating citizen freedom from enslaved submission. The act was both physical and social, a warning woven into daily life. For the women, the lash stripped away not only dignity but any illusion of safety, since discipline could follow them into the heart of the polis. Yet flogging was only one method of inscribing subjugation. Athenians sought punishments that left marks which even time could not erase. But whipping was not the only way Athenians wrote power on enslaved flesh. Some punishments aimed to brand that subordination permanently. Athenian democracy wrote its order in fire. Among the harshest punishments faced by enslaved women was branding with heated bronze or iron. This act was not only about pain in the moment but about leaving a permanent reminder of their status. Marks were often burned into visible places such as the forehead or arms, ensuring that no clothing could cover them. Once seared into the flesh, the mark followed the woman wherever she went, a constant advertisement of ownership and degradation. The tools themselves, rods or stamps heated in open flame, were simple, but their effect was lasting. Branding functioned as both deterrent and identification. A runaway woman could be instantly recognized and seized, her skin carrying proof of bondage. In regulated spaces like bathhouses or state-supervised quarters, inspectors checked these brands during transactions, reducing women to certified property like livestock. For those marked, there was no return to anonymity, no chance of passing into free society without exposure. The branded body was a living document of subjugation, a message written for master, market, and community alike. To the Athenians, such scars were not cruelty but administrative necessity, a way to maintain order in a society that prized freedom for its citizens. Once marked, enslaved women were trapped in an identity burned into their very skin, but punishment did not end in the marketplace. What awaited them inside the walls of the oikos, where daily life unfolded, was another kind of suffering. The whip might rest, but the burden never did. For many enslaved women, life in Athens meant an endless cycle of household labor. Their days began before sunrise, carrying heavy jars from public fountains, grinding grain into flour, tending smoky hearths, and preparing meals. Hours were spent at the loom, weaving cloth until their fingers ached. Beyond these tasks, they cleaned floors, nursed infants, watched over children, and cared for the sick or elderly, all without pause. Every corner of the household demanded their presence, and their labor kept the oikos running smoothly. Yet the work itself was only part of their hardship. Female slaves lived under constant surveillance, with their mistakes quickly punished. A dish broken, a chore left incomplete, or a child unsettled could provoke harsh words or the sting of the rod. Their service was defined not only by toil but by the looming threat of discipline that reinforced their status as property. The intimacy of the household meant that there was no distance between master and servant, no escape from oversight. Even in moments of exhaustion, rest was rarely permitted, for their value lay in being ever ready to serve. Still, the oikos was more than a site of labor. It was also a theater where power over enslaved women could take more personal and invasive forms. Within the house, the slave woman's silence was her only shield. The intimacy of the oikos exposed enslaved women to dangers that went beyond grinding labor. Living and working in kitchens, bedrooms, and nurseries meant they were never far from the gaze of their masters. Without legal recognition of marriage or family, enslaved women had no rights to protect them against coercion. Any relationship they formed had no standing in Athenian law, and any children they bore were not their own but belonged to the household. This lack of legal identity made them defenseless against sexual exploitation, a risk that blurred the line between domestic service and personal violation. Unlike male slaves, whose labor was often public and physical, female slaves endured a private vulnerability where exploitation could be hidden within the ordinary rhythms of household life. Their silence was enforced both by law and by fear, for resistance could bring swift punishment. To be a dul was to live with constant uncertainty, whether the next command would be another chore or another form of control. The walls of the home offered no safety, for they enclosed a space where power was both intimate and absolute. Yet even when women left the household for tasks or service, public life in Athens carried its own reminders that they were considered property first and human second. Every lash, every brand was not just tolerated, it was regulated. In Athens, the punishment of enslaved women was woven into civic administration itself. Household overseers and pedagogoi supervised discipline within private homes, ensuring obedience to the master's will. Beyond the household, market officials known as politai inspected enslaved people during transactions, sometimes checking for brands that marked ownership or profession. In this way, punishment was not a hidden act of cruelty but a recognized element of commerce and law. The city's institutions treated the bodies of enslaved women as documents to be managed, proof of order within a system that prized efficiency and control. This bureaucratic oversight gave violence a sense of legitimacy, presenting it as part of proper regulation rather than abuse. For the women themselves, it meant that discipline could come not only from a master but also under the authority of public officials, leaving no corner of life free from supervision. Regulation created exposure, and exposure deepened humiliation, reminding enslaved women that their suffering was not private misfortune but a civic fact. Such normalization turned punishment into a tool of psychological control as much as physical force. Slavery killed not only the body's freedom, but the soul's belonging. For enslaved women in Athens, punishment was designed to wound dignity as much as flesh. Public whippings, visible brands, and the constant possibility of exposure turned their suffering into a form of theater, performed before citizens who accepted humiliation as proof of order. The degradation was not limited to punishment alone. Enslaved women were excluded from the bonds that gave meaning to life in the city. They could not marry, their unions held no recognition, and their children were never their own but counted as property of the household. Motherhood, which granted honor to free Athenian women, became a source of further loss for the enslaved, whose offspring only reinforced the cycle of bondage. Deprived of civic identity, they stood outside the community of the polis, alive but socially erased. This state of social death ensured that even without constant blows, the awareness of permanent exclusion weighed on them daily. Pain and humiliation reinforced each other, stripping enslaved women of both autonomy and belonging. Yet this raises a stark question. How could Athenians, who celebrated themselves as champions of liberty, justify such cruelty while praising freedom? Athens' wisest minds built theories upon women's chains. The city's philosophers, often celebrated as founders of Western thought, did not challenge the institution of slavery but instead gave it intellectual support. Xenophon, in his Economicus, described how a master should train enslaved women much like animals, teaching them obedience through discipline and repetition. His language revealed how normalized it was to see a female slave's labor and will as something to be molded for the household's benefit. Aristotle went further, calling slaves living tools in his Politics. To him, their subordination was natural, even necessary for the functioning of the polis. By framing slavery as part of the natural order, he offered justification to practices that stripped women of freedom and identity. These arguments gave philosophical weight to everyday cruelty, reinforcing the idea that punishment and control were not only acceptable but rational. The very men who praised reason and liberty built their visions of order upon the backs of those denied both. The contradiction is sharp. Athens could imagine freedom as a political ideal only by excluding enslaved women from humanity itself. So what does this contradiction tell us about Athenian democracy itself? Every citizen's freedom was financed by someone else's bondage. In Athens, the principle of isonomia, equality before the law, was celebrated as the core of democracy, yet it applied only to free male citizens. Women, foreigners, and especially enslaved people stood outside this promise. For enslaved women, the contrast was starkest. While citizens spoke proudly in the assembly, these women endured punishments that made their lack of rights visible to all. The liberty of the polis was not independent of slavery but rested upon it. The leisure that allowed men to debate politics and philosophy was sustained by the hidden labor of women grinding grain, carrying water, and tending households under threat of the lash. Public freedom was possible only because private oppression supplied the time and order on which it relied. Athens displayed itself as a model of civic virtue, but the very spaces of liberty, the agora, the courts, the workshops, were also places where enslaved women were beaten, branded, or humiliated. Democracy in practice was not a universal good but a restricted privilege, dependent on silencing others. This shadow cannot be separated from Athens' achievements. But can we interpret this legacy without confronting its silence? Athens gave the world liberty, but first it branded it into flesh. The history of enslaved women in classical Athens forces us to face a difficult paradox. The city that praised itself as the home of democracy also relied on chains, whips, and brands to sustain its daily life. The punishments inflicted on these women, whether through public flogging, permanent marking, endless labor, or silent exploitation, were not accidents of a cruel age but woven into the very fabric of Athenian society. Yet their own voices are almost entirely absent from the record. What we know comes through the writings of men who saw them as property, not as people. Their stories survive only in fragments, glimpsed through laws, plays, and accounts that rarely acknowledge their humanity. To remember them is to confront the uncomfortable truth that freedom for some was built upon the subjugation of others. If Athens is celebrated as a cradle of democracy, then the lives of enslaved women remind us that its foundations were stained by suffering. Recognizing this silenced history does not erase Athens' achievements but gives a fuller, truer picture of the past, one that honors those whose pain was long ignored.